Is it too easy for kids to vape? Is net zero good for business? And whose policies will stop the boats? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Tory peer Stuart Jackson, Labour MP Stella Creasy, the organiser of the Battle of Ideas Festival Ella Whelan, and the Chief Executive of the Confederation of British Industry, Rain Newton-Smith. On today's programme.
And then I was taking 4,000 puffs and they were lasting me about 4 days.
The 12-year-old girl campaigning against vaping after suffering a collapsed lung as the government plans a clampdown.
We're committed to taking action. The Prime Minister has been clear that we will bring forward action to stop this.
So I decided to take a pragmatic, proportionate and realistic approach to reaching net zero.
I say speed ahead. Speed ahead with investment.
Are net zero policies good or bad for the economy? The Supreme Court considers whether the government can send asylum seekers to Rwanda. The Labour leader says he'd scrap that policy.
It's hugely expensive. It's a tiny number of individuals who would go to Rwanda. And the real problem is at source.
And what do young people want from politics?
As a young person, obviously, housing and getting on the property ladder is something that I thought, I consider a lot.
Things like net zero, more affordable homes and investment in the NHS.
Loads to talk about this lunchtime, but first of all, the government's given more details about its proposed clampdown on the selling of vapes in England, mainly to make them less attractive to children. One child who found them all too attractive is Sarah Griffin, who the BBC have been speaking to today.
Like right before going to bed, the first thing I'd do is take a draw of my puff bar and then put it onto my pillow and then go to sleep. Like a 600 puff wasn't even lasting me a full day, it was lasting me about 3-4 hours. And then I was taking 4,000 puffs and they were lasting me about 4 days. I've seen 7-year-olds doing it. I've seen 6-year-olds doing it, just walking about the streets. But these children don't know anything about it.
Stella, have you got children like that in your constituency?
Yeah, I've had lots of parents come to me terrified about very recently there was a loophole that was allowing people to sell vapes to young children and to market them to them. I mean, if you are an adult, are you really going to be buying bubblegum flavoured vape? It's very clearly this is targeting children, and school teachers saying how worried they were about kids. The Children's Commissioner has come out saying how worried she is about the sale of vapes. It's absolutely right that we act. I'd like to see us, frankly, go further, because also the disposable vapes, I think, need to be dealt with. It's very clear that vaping can help some people give up smoking, but when you're talking about kids who've never started smoking in the first place and now they're using a vape, there's clearly a public health challenge there.
Stuart?
Well, I voted for the smoking ban when I was in the Commons in 2008. I never regretted it. But I favour a more incremental approach of education and information. I do think children and young people shouldn't be vaping. But I think more draconian legislation is probably not the right way. I think we do need to be incremental in the way we approach this.
So just to be clear, so are you opposed then to the government policy of increasing the smoking age so that there's a whole generation of children who never start smoking?
Well, I think...
Which is separate from the vaping thing.
I think, Adam, on paper it looks fine, but obviously it's only been trialled in New Zealand and we haven't seen it anywhere else. I'd like to see more details of it. But remember, prevalence of smoking amongst young people, particularly young women, has absolutely crashed in the last 20 or 30 years. And that's not necessarily because of the smoking ban. It's because people have access to information about their health and their choices. I'd like to see the details of the legislation before I support it or otherwise.
Stella's point about should there ever be bubblegum flavoured vapes on sale?
No, because I agree with Stella, which I don't always.
That's quite surprising to hear you say that.
No, because that's very clearly an attempt to get young children to get on the treadmill of vaping, and I don't think that's a good thing. So I do think there should be regulations in place to prevent that.
Ella, people are talking about, OK, is this the thin end of a wedge? And actually, all governments of any political stripe from now on will be keener to intervene in our choices. And that's actually what's going on here. It's a kind of epochal shift in how governments intervene in health.
Yeah, I think it's a big problem. I'm opposed.
What, the government intervening is the problem?
Yeah, in relation to smoking, the dangers of health and everything else of smoking raise awareness for themselves. You're very hard pressed to find even a child who doesn't know that smoking is bad. So we're not having a row about that. But I think what is at stake here is adults' freedom to be able to make decisions that are neither good nor reasonable. You know, the ability to, the freedom to smoke is something I think even non-smokers should be invested in, because it sets up a relationship with the state and the individual that governments should intervene to prevent us against all risk and all danger. I think that's a problem. I mean, Stella, you mentioned that vaping helps people give up. It's a huge factor in people giving up, a really, really big factor. I mean, we know that anecdotally, but we also know that the introduction
No, but this isn't the government trying to stop vapes being available for adults who want to quit or give up. This is about making sure that kids don't.
I know, but we have to consider the knock-on effects. And, you know, I mean, I know you're making a joke about bubblegum vapes. If you stand out around Shoreditch and Old Street, you'll smell mists of blueberry and all kinds of things. I mean, there's a lot of guys who do this kind of thing. There is a difference between having a approach from a parent's perspective, school's perspective, on being very fervent on anti-vapes. I mean, the story of that child is terrible, but I would question why she's been allowed to go to bed with a vape on her pillow. I mean, I think we also do, as parents, have to take a responsibility in talking to our kids about these kinds of things. But when it comes to state intervention in public health, the government, and unfortunately the Labour Party seems to be supporting them, have just rode right over personal liberty, personal freedom, and, you know, this fundamental issue that we should be allowed to make decisions for ourselves that other people don't agree with, whether that's vaping or smoking or anything else.
Rain, I'll come to you in a second, Stella.
The Children's Commission report was really clear. You've got little kids who don't go to the loo all day at school because there's people vaping in the toilets and they're terrified of going in, and the peer pressure. Right.
Absolutely.
So there you go, Ella. There are limits to the personal freedoms that you're talking about. At what point is the proportionate balance? And here it's very, very clear that kids are at harm. There is no, like you say, we'd agree there's no good reason for a child to vape. So the proposals that are in front of us are about what do we do to protect children. They're not about the liberty of hipsters in Shoreditch to smoke pineapple vapes.
Well, you both just kind of nodded and said, absolutely, we should ban bubblegum flavoured vapes. I can't believe I'm standing here defending bubblegum flavoured vapes.
I've just said there's a certain level of self-awareness and dignity involved in whether or not.
It's a bit like the kind of plain packaging debate. It's a bit like all these things have been in relation to the smoking ban. A government's approach to helping people to give up, which is a noble cause. I think we all, you know, I'm not going to stand here and say, I hope everyone smokes, because I don't. But that sort of the idea of a government trying to curtail people's choice, whether it's consumer choice or anything else, in order to sort of save us from ourselves, I don't think anyone who has a freedom-loving bone in their body should be interested in that.
Okay, Rain.
Look, I think it's a clear case where you need good regulation, and regulation that's developed in consultation with doctors, with parents, with teachers, and with industry and businesses themselves. I think, look, as a parent, it's deeply worrying if there are, you know, if there are elements where people are selling or making vapes appeal to underage people. I think everyone's clear we don't want. You know, this is a product that should be available for adults.
Haven't we just seen it's quite hard to decide whether a product is aimed at children or not, because grown-ups might like bubblegum flavoured vapes. Other flavours are available.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I think this is the challenge, right? Bubblegum may appeal to adults or not. I'm not the one to be able to give that judgment. But what I think we do need to make sure is that the reason why vapes are available is it helps to get adults off tobacco products, which we know are much worse for their health. The evidence on that is clear. And I think what the industry wants to do is support the government smoke-free by 2030. So I think you need to have regulation that is done proportionately in consultation with health professionals, as well as businesses who will also be concerned about businesses who may not be playing by the rules, right? So I think it's somewhere where you've got to have some intervention into the market.
I just wonder for you guys at the CBI though. So you must have. I'm assuming you've got members who are in the tobacco industry and retailers who sell these products. But actually, doesn't that mean you're skewed towards them because you don't have doctors and health professionals? You don't represent them, and it's not your job to represent them. But it means you might only have one side of the argument.
Look, I think this is where I'm saying consultations need to be done, you know, by consulting with the wider public, with health professionals and everyone. And some, you know, our membership will have a view, but they are only one proportion. I think you need to talk to the British Retail Consortium, who obviously can see, you know, I think that's that there are people who are, you know, selling products within their stores, right, who want that to be done well and appropriately and not sold to underage customers, right? That no one wants these products to get to children in the first place, right? So I think it's about working with the industry to make sure that that doesn't happen. They know and can help on that. And also, you know, the issues around good disposal of products too, right? We don't want to be creating waste unnecessarily. So I think you need to do that in consultation with a whole range of businesses, but also health professionals and also with parents.
Ella, just hang a second, Stuart.
I was just going to say, the language of politics is priorities, and if you were talking about children's health...
But the language of socialism was priorities.
Well, politics as well.
OK.
I'm slowly converting it.
And, you know, a government that's going down this track is not looking at, for instance, ultra-high processed food, which has a much more... really negative impact on children's health, and I think they would have been much better to have look at that area than the issue specifically of vaping.
First they came for the vapes, then they came for the burgers.
It is fairly depressing that the conversation in politics across the political divide now seems to be which is more important to ban. You know, the consensus is that we should ban loads of things. It's just which should we ban first and in what places. I mean, I alluded to sort of parental authority in all of this, but I think it's really quite an important point, which is it's not to say that you should sort of point the finger at parents and say it's your fault when your kids do bad things, because we know that, you know, the authority of the home only extends to such a degree. But I think if we're setting up a situation in which we say that it's the government's business rather than parents and your guardians and, you know, teacher influence and all of that, to have to educate but also to influence children, that's a pretty damaging judgment on parental authority.
You have to have a balance between the two.
And
because
it's also
at the other end, you've got the NHS, which is having to deal with the ramifications of smoking and obesity and stroke and heart disease.
I know, but
so it's not a one-way
street. You can have all the theoretical battle of ideas, debates you want about big freedoms. You've got schools where kids are under peer pressure to vape, when vaping is supposed to be something to help stop children.
Do you know what?
If I
come on,
you know,
it's out of touch to recognise there's a problem in the classroom, so you've got to try and deal with it.
I think sneering at public debate will do you no favours, Stella. And I think that one of the interesting things...
who's not been into a school and seen the problem.
I used to work
Do you know what? Let's
The interesting thing is there has been no public debate on this smoking announcement, and certainly not on this vaping announcement. And it's funny to me that Labour politicians are lapping up Rishi Sunak's attempt to do this big policy announcement.
No, I'm sorry. I was involved in debates in Parliament about this for some time because parents have been coming to me about it because they're worried that absolutely they want to take responsibility, but they can also see their kids are under pressure. It makes perfect sense to work with them. I think you'll find amongst parents, as well amongst kids who are horrified by what's going on in their schools, this is going to be pretty popular.
Let's pause that debate there and have a totally different one, because after the Labour and Conservative Party conferences, there's now quite a clear dividing line between the two leaders about how far and how fast to actually get to net zero, even though they agree on the ultimate destination. Let's listen to them.
When I looked at the reality of what people were being asked to do, the thousands of pounds people would need to pay, all of that disproportionately falling on the poorest in society, by the way, and all of it not actually necessary in those time frames to meet our net zero targets, I concluded it simply wasn't right. So I decided to take a pragmatic, proportionate and realistic approach to reaching net zero.
When Rishi Sunak says, row back on our climate mission, I say,
speed ahead. Speed ahead with investment. Speed ahead with 500,000 jobs. Speed ahead with great British energy.
And this lunchtime, there's been a bit of a development. If you head over to the BBC News website, you will see this headline, which says UK net zero targets harder to achieve after PM's speech. advisors, and the advisors are the UK Climate Change Committee, who are an independent committee who kind of run the rule over the government's climate change policies and say whether they're going to get to net zero or not, or hit their other targets. And they've done an assessment of what the Prime Minister was saying in his speech a few weeks ago about making some changes to net zero policies. And it's a bit of a mixed bag. They say the stuff about shunting back the ban on the sale of petrol and diesel cars will not make that much difference, but they say that the changes to off-grid homes getting rid of their oil boilers will make it harder to reach net zero. And they also criticise the government for not being transparent enough about how they're still going to hit their targets as a result. And they also said the UK's leadership role is under threat. Rain, do you agree with the Climate Change Committee now they've given their assessment of what the PM was saying a couple of weeks ago?
Look, I haven't seen the full assessment, but generally what I can say from what businesses want to see is they do want to see us really focused on achieving our net zero targets. It's embedded within law, and actually there's a huge opportunity for the UK in developing our green growth markets. If you think about how we've led the world in developing offshore wind, and it's still a really important part of our economy, they absolutely do want to see us committed to those goals and see the policy details in how we deliver that. And I think reflecting on both the party conferences, it was good to see both parties talking about planning, talking about grid connections. That's how we connect into our electricity grid, which is going to be so important in how we achieve a cleaner, better economy. And we know that if the slower we are in achieving our net zero targets, the greater the overall cost to our economy. So I think we absolutely do want to see more action. Businesses were concerned about the shifting in goalposts around electric vehicles shifting out to 2035. You're right, most car manufacturers are continuing to invest in electric vehicles, but they're concerned about the signals it sends to consumers as well. And what we need to see is the infrastructure to deliver the transition, whether it's around homes, whether it's about how we heat our homes, whether it's about how we move around the country, electric vehicles, thinking about public transport as well. So look, there's a pretty clear consensus in the business community on this, and they really are pushing both parties to be ambitious on how we deliver that journey to net zero.
Stuart, if you read this assessment from the Climate Change Committee, and I'm aware, I realise none of you have had the chance to because they sent it to us journalists first, but they do say the stuff about gas boilers and making an exemption so that not everyone has to move to a heat pump eventually will make energy bills more expensive in the long run. So that means that's a damaging attack on Rishi Sunak, isn't it? Because Labour can now say Rishi Sunak's decisions are making your energy bills higher.
I don't think so. I think it's above party politics because I think both parties have not been honest about the trade-offs that you're going to have in decarbonising the UK.
Okay, be honest about it now.
Well, I will be honest with it. Even the Climate Change Committee said that 62% of carbon emissions reductions will be behavioural changes. It won't be technology. Rain's talking about technological change. And the fact is, it's going to have a huge fiscal impact on ordinary families, retrofitting housing, on agriculture, on transport, on energy, everything else. And what we didn't have in 2017 and 18 is a proper debate in Parliament and outside on those trade-offs and the likely costs. And this hysteria in reaction by some of the zealots on one side to Rishi Sunak's changes. All he's doing actually is settling on the European consensus, what they're doing in France, Germany, Italy, on, for instance, on petrol vehicles. So I do think both parties need to be honest about what it's going to cost ordinary families to decarbonise our whole world.
I think the other thing you have to is what are the costs if we don't decarbonise, right? If we've seen, we've seen the impact of extreme weather events, what it does in terms of flooding in the UK. We are already feeling those impacts. We only have to think to a couple of summers ago where we saw our infrastructure came to a halt because it wasn't resilient to really extreme temperatures.
Well, we've had the best record in Europe on carbon emissions reduction since 1990.
Absolutely, and I think what we want to see is the UK building on that. And what we don't want to do is to lose some of our competitive advantage we've set ourselves by helping to develop some of those green markets. So I think we need to continue to help develop that. And also, you're right, so much of this change will happen through how we live our lives. But I think sometimes we present that in a really negative way. And actually having a better insulated home is a more comfortable home, right? And being able to, drive an electric vehicle, if you have the right infrastructure, and that's where there is an important debate
I agree with you on
to be had, right? They are nicer cars to drive. You don't have to go to a petrol station to fill them up. Yes, you do need to find a good place to recharge them, and that's important. But a lot of these products will be better for us as consumers as well. And so we need to think about the costs of inaction as well as some of the changes we need to make on that journey.
Stella, Labour have said they would put the ban on the sale of petrol and diesel cars back to 2030. But the Climate Change Committee today is saying actually moving it back 5 years doesn't make that much difference.
So I think for me that's about predictability for business, about what the targets are, what you need to work for. I mean, the chaos...
Moving it be more unpredictable.
Yes,
another change.
Which is what the government has just done.
Yeah, but surely adding another change to the first change, that's more unpredictability.
No, because they're pressing ahead with it. I think saying, yes, absolutely, this matters, and more importantly, the plans that Johnny Reynolds has set out to invest in the electric car vehicle. Why should electric cars be only for the preserve of the incredibly wealthy, which they are at the moment because they're still quite expensive? If you invest in that industry, then absolutely there are jobs to be created and you can drive down the price. And I think that's where actually I would agree with you, Stuart. We need to be much more honest because actually there are real benefits from net zero to people's bottom line. I'm acutely conscious that we are living through a cost of living crisis. But if the last couple of years has taught us anything about our energy bills, we need to make sure that we move towards net zero and we make it much easier for people to heat and look after their houses much more cheaply. And actually the technology for the kind of things we're talking about is now cheaper than replacing your existing gas boiler. The market is moving very quickly. So government has two choices. It can either rail against some non-existent threat that somehow not being part of this market is going to be cheaper, or actually we can get on and make sure that those investments and those benefits are felt by the people who are struggling still with their energy bills.
Ella?
I think for a lot of people, net zero has come to basically just mean eco-austerity, which is that, unfortunately, rather than some of the productive conversations that Rain alluded to, which is, putting investment into innovation around, inventing ourselves out of the climate crisis and climate challenge, looking into nuclear, looking into different energy sources, doing all that, fundamentally building a British economy that has the wealth and the momentum to be able to do all of that.
Okay, so what's an eco-austere thing that's happening, well, being pledged?
Well, for example, I have to say that there's really actually not that much difference between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. Everybody thinks there is. All that Rishi Sunak's done is push it back by a few years. He's got no plans for anyone to suddenly find 30 grand for an electric car within those 5 years. So really, for your layperson, the plans on net zero, the ideology of net zero is exactly the same. Rishi Sunak's gone at pains to say, I haven't given up on this idea. It's just that I'm moving it a bit further down the road. But that's, for example, retrofitting your house. Who doesn't want to live in a nice insulated home? Who has thousands of pounds to do it?
Well, there's government grants to help you pay for it.
Yeah, for every single person to retrofit your house? If you live in a...
Well, it's means tested, which is a fair way of doing it,
If you live in a council flat like I grew up in, the idea of having a heat pump or something like that isn't...
Yeah, and the council would pay that because that's social housing.
But in terms of quality of life of, for example, the way in which heat pumps work as opposed to as a gas boiler, if you look at electric cars, again, your good point you made about the infrastructure around electric cars, it's not there, but also, just as a kind of simple thing, you go to a petrol station, you fill up your car, you go on with your day. Electric cars where you have to sit there for a prolonged period, it's not instantaneous. The point I'm trying to make is that we seem to be constantly sidelining the issue of people's quality of life and the idea that we should be making life better, cleaner, more efficient, all the rest of it, but better, having more time, more wealth, more leisure periods in our life. And I think the net zero obsession seems to have forgotten a lot of that. They've forgotten the question of choice, forgotten the question of how you might, I appreciate and I was, I'm all for the Labour Party's ideas around green innovation and green jobs. I don't think anyone would be opposed to that. But one, there hasn't been any kind of substantial detail on it. And two, they haven't given up the punitive measures, whether that's around cars, whether that's around boilers or
Stella, answer.
I don't recognise the picture you're painting, mainly because I don't see any evidence that heat pumps are less efficient. I mean that somehow they break down more.
But how about
and
Ella's
actually,
point?
they are
say
cheaper.
they break down more.
Right. So actually, if they are cheaper,
it's not like
than
when you turn on the boiler and the house heats up like that.
If they are cheaper than replacing a gas boiler, we're seeing companies now offering people free electricity. Like, I talk to people and their bills are massive. Of course, that means their bills will be cheaper. You talk about eco-austerity. Surely also you have to be fair and look at the eco-benefits.
But can I just say the two of you have just sat there and agreed and said, you know, oh, mea culpa, us politicians have not told the public how crap their lives are going to get.
No,
and
sorry,
we should
Ella,
be
that's
honest
absolutely
with
not
them.
what I said.
That
I
is
said
what
the
you
reverse.
the two
Absolutely
you
no.
just
What
said.
I said was I want us to be more honest.
I'm a commentator, there's no mea culpa.
I want us to be more honest about the fact that actually there are benefits to people, that actually you can cut your bills, and you can cut your bills not just once,
but when though, Stella? Because it's not going to help this winter or next winter or the winter after, is it?
Like Octopus are doing, where they're putting together people to have windmills, which now means that you can get a 50% reduction in your energy bills. That's massive for people. I represent
if you live near
communities.
that wind farm.
No, but they've had 18,000 requests from communities to do this. It's off the scale around the country. Actually, what worries me when you talk about eco-austerity is that you're not doing justice to all the benefits that could come, frankly, if government got its act together to invest it. You're right about the electric charging places. That makes the argument to make sure that there are more of them.
Stuart, very quickly, from a Conservative point of view, is Theresa May's legislation for net zero a bigger crime against the nation than her Brexit deal ever was?
Well,
and actually, history will judge her for that rather than Brexit.
We've only got a 45-minute show if you talk to me about Theresa May's failings. But no, seriously, there wasn't a proper debate. We do have a slightly cultish religiosity about net zero, and I do think we need to look at the evidence. And I come back to that: 62% of carbon emissions reductions are going to be behaviour changes, and that's not going to be asking people sweetly. It's going to be punitive taxes.
And why should we accept that? And why should we, as citizens, accept that?
And if the evidence, can I just say, if the evidence is there for technical change to change people's lives, I want to see the evidence and I will support it. But I don't just want to see this default position to punitive taxes.
Okay.
Bills.
Right, shall we have something else? Shall we have something else that everyone can disagree about now? The government's policy to send migrants to Rwanda and not let them claim asylum in the UK. That has been the subject of 3 days of discussion and evidence giving in the Supreme Court. And in December, Supreme Court justices will have to decide whether they agree with the appeal courts that people shouldn't be sent to Rwanda, or whether they agree with the High Court that they should. That's what those judges are trying to settle. But it's kind of settled in the Labour Party's mind, because this is what Keir Starmer said to Laura Kuenssberg on Sunday, or the Laura Kuenssberg programme on Sunday, about how he'd approached the Rwanda policy.
Yes, I think it's the wrong policy. It's hugely expensive. It's a tiny number of individuals who would go to Rwanda. And the real problem is at source.
So, Stella, if, let's say, the Supreme Court say, yeah, the Rwanda policy can go ahead and some migrants are sent to Rwanda, then Labour wins the election, repeals the policy, would those people be allowed back? Would you repatriate them back from Rwanda?
I mean, these are yeah, there's a huge number of kind of potential in that.
Yeah, but it's potential, it could happen.
No, what I do know is that every person that gets sent to Rwanda on the government scheme costs £60,000 more than had they stayed here. And I look at the backlog, and I'm one of those people who's got a constituency with a lot of people stuck in the limbo of the UKBA, and I just think there are better ways. Sorry, the Borders Agency. You know, there are better ways to spend the money to tackle the challenges that people see. Stuart and I would agree. We all want to stop the boats. Nobody wants to support the people smugglers, but this policy will not do that. It will cost millions. I mean, I think it's £170 million we spent so far for a handful of people. And it will keep being more expensive than actually getting on and processing people and being able to say, well, what are the challenges to do with a world where you've got a lot of refugees?
But Labour aren't committing to allowing people sent to Rwanda to come back.
Well, because nobody knows what will happen to those people. And one of the reasons there is
it's plausible that.
Okay, but one of the reasons there is a court case is because there is evidence that the Rwanda repatriates people to the countries where they have fled from. I mean, also, just on moral grounds alone, you know, you and I might disagree, Stuart, about where people should be processed, but surely refoulement, the idea of sending people back to the danger that they were fleeing from in the first place, is beyond the pale.
Although it is interesting when you read the judgments, because the High Court didn't feel that way, and in the appeal court, 3 judges ruled on it, and only 2 of the judges there felt that way. So
And
that's what the Supreme Court are having to sort
That's
out.
why we're having a court case to look at the evidence. And it's a telling thing, isn't it, that we didn't have that debate in Parliament.
Stuart, when you were a special advisor, your boss was David Davis, who was the Brexit secretary. David Davis has come out very strongly against the Rwanda policy. What do you think?
He's not right on everything.
I remember a time when you said he was, but OK, that's different jobs, different times.
I was on a salary then, Adam. No, but seriously...
We are a Conservative peer.
I am a Conservative peer.
And that's an allowance rather than a salary, isn't it? Okay.
But no, I mean, I don't fundamentally disagree with some of the things that Stella's saying, but the problem is reality will make contact with the Labour Party if they get into government, just as it did in the Blair and Brown government. And the fact is, most people know that these asylum seekers coming over in small boats are economic migrants. They're mainly young men, and they are coming here for a better life. And I'm not decrying that. People would do it. But we don't have a responsibility to house them and do everything else.
Well, no, you do under international law.
Stuart, I'm sorry, but that is simply not the case. The top nationalities of the people in the boats are from Iran, they're from Syria, they're from Afghanistan. No, they're not. The Albanian, actually, you really need to look at the numbers.
I've looked at the numbers.
And unless you've done the processing, you cannot say that about those people. But we can say that people fleeing from Iran...
Hold on.
Come on,
well, hang on a bit, Stella. You say...
I mean, I had...
There are lots of these myths being circulated without contestation.
No, I had a lot of immigration cases in my constituency when I was in the Commons, and I know the points you're making. But fundamentally, Labour don't have a policy. You can't keep repeating safe routes all the time.
No, they do have a policy. They would do a returns agreement with the EU and
that isn't a policy. That's an open door policy. That's a green light for many, many people who are not truly in fear of their lives as asylum seekers.
How is a returns agreement with the EU under a Labour government an open-door immigration policy? It's about sending people back through the door,
It's the message of Rwanda, if it's successful and if it's upheld by the Supreme Court, is that the business model will be broken. That's fundamentally, in extremis, what the government has had to look at. Also, of course, it's reviewing and will eventually review the membership of the European Court of Human Rights, because it takes the view that if you can't, as a sovereign nation, defend your own borders and make your own immigration policy, then you need to look at that supranational legal entity. But I think Rwanda is an idea and a policy that will work if it's agreed by the Supreme Court, because it will break the model of the evil people traffickers.
Rain, I thought the CBI wouldn't want to get involved in this because it's very, very political, but go ahead.
Look, I'm not going to talk about the more politicised elements of this. I think what I would say, though, is from a business point of view, I think when we talk, one of the things that concerns me is when we confuse policies around refugees and asylum seekers with wider immigration policy, because that does make it more challenging for businesses when they're thinking about how we find people to grow businesses. And we know that that's a huge challenge. Over 2/3 of businesses find it challenging to find people to grow their business.
And does the whole stop the boats rhetoric make that even harder?
Well, I think just a few points I would make. First of all, you know, business, and we've supported asylum seekers having the right to work while their status is being determined, because they're able to contribute to our economy, and it's important for them as individuals. And I think having a humane policy around refugees is important. And we have to recognise what refugees over the course of our history have contributed to our economy in the UK. But apart from that, and that is to one side, it's thinking about the role of immigration in our economy more generally. Think about international students, what they bring to our universities, and also what they then take back to their home countries when they return to work with better skills and also an understanding of the UK and what we're able to contribute. You know, higher education is one of our biggest exports. And I think we don't think, and the problem that businesses then face is this then becomes very politicised. So they can't make the case for why we may need to see immigration to tackle very acute skill shortages in the NHS or with HGV drivers. And those should be time limited. But I think one of the problems is it becomes a very politicised debate, whereas businesses want to see some of those economic factors being considered when we're talking about wider immigration policy.
Ella, do you want them to stop the boats?
Well, I want there to be some kind of coherent policy. And I think I'm not in favour of the Rwanda policy. I think just as because I think it's wrong to export your immigration problem. Just as much as I disagreed with the EU's relationships with Libya or elsewhere, this is an issue that you have to deal with yourself. I also simultaneously think it's a problem that government can't make and enact democratic policy without seeming to run into this constant issue of being thwarted, if you want to use that word, by courts and judges. And I think from a kind of populist perspective among ordinary people watching the news, that tension is extremely irritating. You want something to be done and it seems to be incapable of being done. But I think that, I actually think that we should have a much broader conversation about the immigration system, about what we deem to be legal immigration. The point system at the moment is incredibly punitive. You have to have like a PhD in something highfalutin to be able to come and work here, when we know that actually a lot of those Albanians could work elsewhere in the economy. And so Stuart is right. The Labour Party, I agree with the Labour Party's criticisms of the Rwanda policy, but they also have to come out honestly with their ideology on this, which is, I'm not talking about numbers, but do you want more immigration? Do you want less immigration?
And that, to me, sounds like a whole other episode of Politics Live. Right, there's a new MP in the Scottish constituency of East Kilbride, Straven and Lesmahago. They're Conservative, and that's because the old MP was an SNP MP. It's all because it's the same person. It's Lisa Cameron. She's today defected on the eve of the SNP's annual conference, and we can talk about it now with Jenny Davidson, the BBC correspondent who joins us from Edinburgh. Hi, Jenny. What's going on?
Well, Lisa Cameron, as you've just said, has announced she's leaving the SNP, joining the Conservatives. She made that announcement through a national newspaper earlier today. Now, this perhaps wasn't entirely unexpected. She's been clearly unhappy for some time, but she has blamed a toxic and bullying culture within the SNP group at Westminster, and she says that's had an impact on her mental health to the extent of seeking counselling. And she says this comes on the back of her speaking out, saying she was unhappy about the handling of harassment allegations against another SNP MP, Patrick Grady, and that has isolated her from the Westminster group. But of course, there was also an issue of selection for the next general election. The new candidate selection results are expected later today, and she was facing possible deselection in her constituency.
Jenny, thank you very much. Now, on the show yesterday, we discussed Labour's house building plans, and one of the guests said that the Labour MP, Rupa Huq, had opposed just about any building in her constituency over 1 storey tall. Well, Rupa Huq has been in touch to let us know that that is not the case, and she pointed out the fact that she has in fact supported new building in her area. And we're going to talk about those house building plans again now, because one of the takeaways from Keir Starmer's conference speech was that he is a YIMBY, a yes in my backyard, and he will bulldoze through local opposition to get more houses built, which has led the conservative-leaning magazine The Spectator to write this: Starmer's house building plan could prove a hit with young voters. Now, somebody who knows the mind of young voters is Scarlett Maguire, who's a pollster. Hi, Scarlett. Do we know, can we talk about young voters as a bloc, or is there a bit more sophisticated way of analysing them?
Well, I mean, I think there's sort of, all voters are more nuanced than you might initially think, especially when you're just looking at sort of data tables. But I think one thing we can say is that the generational divide in UK politics is becoming increasingly stark. So this has been a feature of our politics, especially for the last sort of 10 years or so, but especially over the last, even since 2019, the age in which the Conservatives are sort of winning is going up and up and up. And so now they're only really winning with the over 65s.
I think we can dramatically visualise that with this graph here, which is a bar chart which shows voting intentions by age. And as you can see, in the 18 to 24-year-old age group, and this is based on polling by the pollsters Survation done in August, the Labour have just an absolutely enormous lead. And then at the other end of the table, the Conservatives have a fairly large-ish lead, but it's only large-ish. What are the issues that are driving those bars in that bar chart? Scarlett.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a good reason why these voters, these voting blocs behave very differently, and it's because they have very different priorities. So if you look at older voters, they care a lot about the economy. They also care a lot about things like immigration. This is really different for younger voters. And when we say younger voters, I mean, you can mean 18 to 24-year-olds, but actually we're seeing 18 to 24-year-olds are probably behaving more similarly to people in their 30s, even their 40s, than those people are with the older generations above them. So younger people, they still care about the economy, but they care a lot more about housing. This is sort of normally their second priority. And then the environment is third. So it's quite different.
Scarlett, thank you very much. And good to know that the range of topics we've discussed appeal to all ages on this programme. Genius, almost like it's planned. Stuart, looking back at that bar chart, which I think maybe Conservatives might call a bar chart of doom, maybe. Is there anything good about that chart?
Looks like a Liberal Democrat bar chart, actually.
No, it's legit. The scale is not fiddled with.
I think the issue for young people, fundamentally for both parties, is housing, and the failure of both parties really to deliver housing for young people, to deliver good quality rented housing and owner occupation. Owner occupation is dropping in this country. People are not getting the opportunity at a young age. They're having to buy huge deposits. They're finding it hard to get mortgages. And I think part of that is that the planning system is fundamentally broken. It needs a new government of whatever complexion to look at it again. And there's just so much kowtowing to NIMBYism, which is wrong. And I'm afraid my own...
So you're a YIMBY like Keir Starmer then?
I am a YIMBY. Well, it's easy for Keir to be a YIMBY because he represents a really urban constituency in Camden in North London. So
he has opposed things in his constituency.
He has opposed things, but it's easy for him as an urban MP to take that view. I do think we've not gone enough along the road to planning reform, building on brownfield sites, getting rid of large-scale housing that the state owns that could be turned over to folk. And I just think we need a fundamental sea change in politics to get building again. And both parties, unfortunately, are responsible for this impasse.
Ella, if the Tories have blown it with young people, does that mean they've actually blown it for the future?
Well, obviously young people's votes are incredibly important, but young people also do tend to get used as a stage army from time to time.
How do you mean?
In terms of there's a sort of a lot of maybe in relation to sort of lowering the voting age, which I'm not opposed to, but there is a sort of a bit of a fetish about what young voters feel. And actually, whether it's housing or anything like that, there's more likely to be divides along class lines than there are along generational lines. I mean, lots of working class people have never owned a house, might want to, but it's never been in their sort of ambitions in the near future. So I think there's a kind of toxicity to a lot of the generational debate, which isn't helpful. It's also the case that there are things that older people care about that young people will eventually care about, like childcare, which I'm obsessed with at the moment. Which if you asked your average 18-year-old, they're probably not going to care that much about it, but that shouldn't be ignored. But I think the interesting thing in relation to housing is that I'm excited by this idea of new towns. I think that's a kind of a way of approaching.
Even if they're imposed on local communities.
I think we've got to be pretty hardline. Right. I think actually we've got to kind of, it should be a YIMBYism.
What about people's freedom to not have a massive new town built next to them?
Well, you've got to have a look at a state's priority is to look at what needs to be done for the benefit of the many, whatever political party used to use that.
In 2007 and 8, it never happened.
And it never happened. And I actually think 1.5 million or whatever it is sounds ambitious, but over the years it isn't that ambitious.
And it's also weirdly the same as the government's housing targets, just spread over longer.
And this can't be done just by looking at the grey belt, which I'm glad the green belt sort of
the less good bits of the green belt
has been breached, and we're finally talking about it.
We're kind of running out of time, so let Rain give us your reaction to the housing stuff from Keir Starmer the last few days.
Well, look, I think, as you pointed out as well, I think from both sides we need to be building 300,000 homes a year to kind of meet Britain's needs. So, and I think reform of the planning system, actually everyone is agreed it needs to be reformed to make it easier to deliver that target. I think, and also I think what we need to do is think how we join that up with some of the other things we need to do around the energy transition, right? So that we're not sort of doing housing here and then thinking about how we heat those homes and making sure they're well insulated, right? This should all be done in parallel so that we're not building homes now that will need to be retrofitted in a few years. That will save everyone money. So I think that's important. And And I just think in terms of what younger people want, again, climate, nature really is important to them. And I think also actually, and even from that demographic point, thinking about childcare and the provision around that. And it's been good to see some developments in that from the government as well.
And Stella, sorry we've run out of time. But
renters reform. Why haven't we got the renters reform bill? Because also lots of young people.
And there we must leave it. I'll be back with Politics UK tomorrow. See you then.